Welcome to the Bottlenecks Institute podcast, where we discuss the critical bottlenecks that hold progress back. We're hosting a special subseries on evolutionary AI, AI safety, and security, focused on the challenges we must solve to accelerate safe progress in AI and AGI. I'm your co-host, Ian Darrington.
And I'm your co-host, Tanya Barakatane.
Really curious as to your take on this. It's a really challenging question. Are you ready for the first question?
Sure, yeah. Great to be here, by the way.
Perfect. Yeah, it's splendid you're here. So, question everybody is thinking about too is AI going to terminate humanity?
Yeah, that's a great question and a big one. And maybe to get at that question, I can first talk a little bit about my background, which gives me the perspective that I have, which is maybe different than some other folks. I've been interested in machine learning research for 20 years now, or around that time. I started my PhD in 2008, when neural networks were really tiny, at least the ones that we were working on. People talk about neural networks at a scale like billions of neurons, and these are the things underneath most of the models we interact with. That's the dominant form of AI is neural networks right now. And so at that time, when I started in a kind of a subfield called evolutionary computation, looking at evolutionary algorithms in neural networks, which was esoteric at the time and still a little bit esoteric today. It has a kind of an evolutionary spin to it, and we'll talk more about evolution later. But I guess what's most important for this question about will AI destroy us is that I lived through the deep learning transition. So when I was starting my PhD, deep learning was just on the horizon, and I viewed it with a lot of skepticism. And so the dominant ideas at the time were like, you can't have neural networks that are more than a couple layers deep. Just it won't work. You always just arrive at a local optimum. And it turns out that we're just a couple breakthroughs away, sometimes pretty trivial stuff in the grand scheme of things, like just using like a ReLU, like this one kind of neural activation function, kind of like a little bit of esoterica, but that enabled gradients to flow better and you can use bigger neural networks. And the dominant idea at the time was that it's crazy to use really big neural networks that are over parameterized, too many more weights than you think are necessary. And to turn out that was wrong. Actually, there's like an interesting phenomenon that you can just they learn better actually with more neurons. I was really skeptical for too long of this kind of like paradigm shift that was happening like into the deep learning world, and that really overhauled a lot of machine learning research, wiped away a lot of stuff that people thought was important, overhauled in particular like machine vision. It's like completely different now than it was back then. And so living through that kind of change, you can see that the experts can be quite wrong on even fundamental issues. And so when we come to this bigger question, like now we're living in a time where neural networks and machine learning is doing a lot more things than they used to be able to do. That it's really quite profound that we have conversations with AI that they speak fluidly to us. That's an incredible change from 20 years ago. I guess that gives me the kind of skepticism where it says if someone feels for sure that AI is going to destroy us or that AI isn't going to destroy us, I discount that perspective a bit because we don't know. That's the flavor of science. We just really don't know what's going to lead to. But that means we should probably take both of those extremes into account. Maybe AI will strictly be positive for us. It really is going to we're going to get AGI in a couple years and it will cure cancer and make the world better in all aspects, and we live in a world of abundance. Or it could be that on the other flip side, people like Eliezer Yudkowsky or other people that are more in the AI safety, kind of afraid of the consequences of AI could be right too. Like it could have a self-accelerating AI somehow that really discounts human value or is to us like we are to ants. It's not out of malice that it destroys us, but simply out of indifference. So I guess it's a long-winded way of saying I'm not sure, but we should prepare for both extremes. I do think it's worrying that there is this possibility of creating something much smarter than us, and we don't know the time frame in which that occurs. And my estimate of that is I guess one theme is just wide error bars. It could be just a breakthrough away. It could be we have 20, 30, 40, 50 years possibly before we hit that. Who knows? But that we don't know how to safely design that. We can't guarantee right now that if we created something, it could run away and kind of in various ways it could kind of run away and have lots of negative consequences for us. So somewhere in that middle perspective, going beyond the binary of it's going to destroy us, it's not going to destroy us, but hopefully preparing for a wide range of outcome and how could we be robust to whatever is coming out of the technology that we're creating.
That's great. I think I would like to move on and talk about your paper that you talk about nitation. Is that nitation?
Nation.
Knightian. It's after this
19.
guy. I
Okay.
think his name is Frank Knight, an economist or something.
Okay.
I think his name is Frank Knight, an economist or something.
So in your paper 19, you quoted the famous quote by Richard Sutton: seeking an improvement that makes a difference in the shorter term, researchers seek to leverage their human knowledge of the domain. But the only thing that matters in the long run is the leverage of the computation. We have to learn a better lesson that building in how we think does not work in the long run. And you talk about the blind spot in ML. I wanted to elaborate more for people not familiar with what is 19 uncertainty, and also how do you think about the blind spot in ML?
Yeah, right. So this is a paper that I wrote with some colleagues called Evolution and the Knightian Blind Spot of Machine Learning. And the claim is that there is a blind spot in machine learning to Knightian uncertainty. And this is a term that this economist, I believe his name is Frank Knight, came up with. In short, Knightian uncertainty is the kind of idea of unknown unknowns, things you don't know that you don't know, as opposed to known unknowns, like things you don't know, and known knowns, things you know. So the basic idea of the paper is that if you look at the formalisms used in machine learning, like the basic equations, and we talk a lot about reinforcement learning in particular in the paper, just this idea that there's states and actions and rewards. And if you look at these formalisms and the kind of assumptions that go along to machine learning algorithms, it often implies that there are no unknown unknowns. The way that it does this is usually there's some assumption that the distribution of the world is going to be exactly the same, more or less, when a model is deployed as when it's trained. And there's lots of ways where that doesn't seem to pan out because we live in a really complicated world, an open world, a large world, where tomorrow someone could invent something we never expected, or whatever assumptions we're currently operating under could be undermined. And it's really hard to put that into the formalisms of machine learning. There's attempts to do it. There's things like meta learning and continual learning that will stretch the formalism of machine learning in certain ways. But in the paper, we talk about how that's actually a little bit deceptive because while you're using the language, we have a system that learns how to learn. Still, you have to specify the distribution of the new situations. So it's almost always in the realm of known unknowns implicitly and not in the realm of unknown unknowns. We contrast this with biological evolution, which we argue is adept at dealing with unknown unknowns because that's just how evolution works. We have a diagram in the paper that claims there's like 4 ways in which evolution is robust to this kind of uncertainty, these unknown unknowns. One is that it operates in this really open-ended search space. Usually in machine learning, you specify what the architecture is of your neural network. You specify the reinforcement learning algorithm that will train a particular neural network how to learn. But in evolution, it's like you can explore all different kinds of architectures that are glued together in different ways. Our learning algorithm isn't just one thing. Our brain has lots of different kinds of neurons and different kinds of configurations. And so it's like evolution has this wide palette from which to design things. Also that in evolution, there's a continual diversification of bets. So in evolution, all of the diversity of life, all the grand diversity of human beings and animals and plants and bacteria has its origin in a single, as far as we know, a single kind of initial replicator, whatever that was. And so evolution tends to just expand and expand and expand, find lots of different ways to solve the problems of life. And this diversification of bets in conjunction with pruning, which means that if some novel situation occurs that actually penalizes or kills off one branch, you can't adapt to it, then it's pruned away. This combination of diversification and pruning, what we call in the paper, diversify and filter, like there's these filtering events that kind of cut off things that can't handle unknown unknowns, tends to lead to things that are able to handle unknown unknowns. Like humans are quite adaptable, not perfectly adaptable, but we in our daily lives are often able to just handle things going astray, things we've never seen before. And it doesn't fundamentally stop us in the way that sometimes machine learning algorithms, when they encounter something unknown, will just kind of freeze in their tracks. And there's much more we could kind of say that, but that's kind of like the picture that there's something about the formalisms of machine learning that get in the way. And that interestingly, evolution never had a formalism and yet was able to create a. So it's a proof of existence that this kind of formalism isn't necessary, at least, to get to something quite incredible.
It seems that You suggest this might not be formal. At the same time, when you do engineering, you need some level of formalization. And there is like a paradox of like, how could we define such a system? Even if you think about an evolutionary based model, there is some level of formalization that will go into it. If you were in charge of creating this new paradigm, how would you design a system, like evolutionary based model, that can go continually learning without formalize or specify certain metrics?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I guess I want to zoom out just a little bit and say, like, so in the paper we do hypothesize that potentially Knightian uncertainty is a blind spot for machine learning because it's possibly it could be impossible to formalize. But we're a little bit agnostic on that. I think if it is possible to formalize, it's also interesting. Might require a different kind of formalization, but I think so far no one's succeeded in doing so. And also, it could be that there are ways to take some of the lessons of biological evolution, this kind of diversify and filter approach, which we contrast to the anticipate and train approach. That's kind of like the general machine learning approach. We'll add more diverse data and hope that things will generalize to unforeseen situations. And the reason in the paper why we think that while that does work, scaling does do something, that there may be fundamental limits to scaling in terms of like unknown unknowns in particular. Okay, so then to your question, if we wanted to create a system that was amenable to dealing with unknown unknowns, then I think the key thing would be to hypothesize, what keeps current systems from doing that. And in the paper, we claim that it could be about diversify and filter. That there's something about that kind of approach as opposed to anticipating and training on on kind of like diverse data. And so there's nothing that prevents us from creating systems that do this kind of diversify filter. And there's like examples within the literature of people that have kind of gone one step down that direction. So one paper we reference is, I think it's work out of UC Berkeley called One Solution is Not All You Need, where in some sense they use like standard machine learning methods to create a lot of diversity. At test time, there's some unanticipated solution and they kind of filter out all their possibilities by the thing that ends up working. And it could be that would be a way that you could take the seed of that paper and try to extend it further. They only do like one step of this, but maybe there's ways of doing that. And another argument is that actually empirically, it's kind of what humans are doing in the research community, that we are diversifying, filtering ideas. It could be that ideas from a field that I've long worked in called open-endedness, which is about more or less how do you make algorithms that embody creative ongoing processes. And the aspiration of those algorithms is to kind of take on some of this role of like what is presently done by the machine learning community. And so like it's trying to, you can say like automate science in the same way that biological evolution in some sense is like an automated R&D kind of factory. So doing applied and basic research at the same time, in that whatever the stepping stones led to human intelligence, they were initially quite removed from human level intelligence, things like bilateral symmetry and all this, the multicellular organisms and all the kinds of basic innovations it created. Um, so I guess in short, the answer would be something like there might be many ways to take ideas from, say, open-endedness, from biological evolution and existing ideas in machine learning and trying to push them together in some way that is more directly facing the idea of unknown unknowns.
I was wondering if you could go into that concept more, thinking about it as a society of models where researchers and industry are creating lots of different ways and we're getting diversification. Certain models are much better in certain domains. We have vertical agents and vertical things in one direction, but they're certainly not general. The big models are generally built to be as generalized as possible and not focus on particular things. So it seems like they're trying to be more robust, but in their robustness, they maybe trade off accuracy and value for particular domains. Could you maybe muse on that a little bit?
I think there's multiple levels of analysis we could go into. Maybe the base level, it's true that there is a lot of diversity of models, really large scale models that are really general, and maybe models that are fine tuned on specific parts of data set to do one task well. But underlying this is basically the same fundamental technology in the formalisms. I think one meta problem is that we may be overinvested in that. And that seems to be kind of a human tendency and a tendency of our systems collapse into one particular paradigm. We're all in on LLMs right now, and not just LLMs, but one particular training modality. Like we do this pre-training next token prediction, then we some kind of RL on top of it. Could be as was the case of the technology that preceded LLMs, that this is some form of slight dead end, and that we need diversity on a greater level to create models more amenable to unknown unknowns. There is research funding for other paradigms and approaches, but it's quite limited. So there's this rich get richer phenomenon that is very human, and yet for reasons related to biological evolution or just deception in general, I guess deception being this phenomenon that we, even though we've seen many examples of where paradigms hit dead ends, we still overinvest in them. There's a book that my PhD advisor, Ken Stanley, and I wrote about why greatness kind of planned about that sort of thing. We tend to always think that the current paradigm, if we extend it further, get us to where we want to go. It could be that we need a little humility to think about the basic assumptions and do that. But okay, that aside, it's true that we will live in a world where there's lots of different agents and different models interacting. It could be that implicitly we will filter out the models that aren't doing good, the right kinds of things in the right situations. I do think there are arguments for why we should diversify these foundation models in general for societal reasons. We talk a little bit in this 19 Uncertainty paper about how when you have correlated sources of fragility. So if everyone, let's say we somehow lived in a world where everyone was using OpenAI's models, then if there is a change in the world and the models are giving kind of like exactly the same, this OpenAI model is giving exactly the same answer to a lot of people about something that it does not match with how the world has changed. I should probably think of what the concrete example of that would be. Then you'll have lots of people doing exactly the wrong thing. In contrast, if we had lots of different model providers and an ecosystem of that, or even if OpenAI was actually serving different models to different people, which could have its own issues, you wouldn't have as much giant correlated fragility. So I think there's like reasonable arguments for why we should hope to have an active diversity of models, small and large, as well as different biases within the models themselves.
Do you feel that the substrate is an important consideration on these? Like right now, they're all silicon based, and there's exciting technologies still upcoming that are brain based and whatnot, computation. Do you see that those would change the paradigm, or would they just be used again in the same ways?
Yeah, I guess I don't know too much about the brain-based kinds of methods, and perhaps it would have like a different bias. I think the substrate is like an interesting layer of diversity, and it could be that could help things, or it could be like some of these substrates might just be, as you're hinting, accelerated ways of doing the same thing.
In life, because we're carbon based, fundamentally, there's more diversity of molecular binding that we have compared to silicon and the energy differential between them too. And it's also the energy storage and information layer directly coupled with the physical or chemistry based substrate that increase the diversity. And in the ML models, we have two distinct paradigm of the diversity is happening mainly in information layer and not in the substrate layer. And I think to me, like one reason we have robustness partially is because of the substrate coupling with the both information layer but also substrate layer. Is one note aside. I'm also very curious to talk about more artificial life because you mentioned what highly ambitious and it has a revolutionary potential. Why do you think artificial life is so important and what it would take for a life to have its breakthrough moment and how can we direct more ML researchers to think about a life?
Artificial life is a field that's close to my heart. It's one of the fields I started within when I was doing my PhD. Artificial intelligence and artificial life both do a similar kind of philosophical move. They take this kind of fuzzy concept of intelligence or of life, and they ask questions about what would it be like to try to explore this fuzzy concept that we don't really understand. Like people will argue about definitions of life or intelligence, and it's hard to really get down to something that convinces everybody. But instead, you can say, let's just do empirical explorations. We're going to try to make different manifestations of intelligence, maybe in a silicon substrate and with these different algorithms, and we'll see what the properties of those are. We can actually come to ground out our theories in some way. And artificial life is doing the same thing, but it's taking this fuzzy concept of life and how might we actually explore that by trying to build it. So it's kind of like both of these have this kind of like maybe we don't understand something deeply until we can engineer it. And in artificial life, it's exploring life. And so could we create life in a different substrate? And the tagline of artificial life, which I like, is as it could be, not life as it is, through engineering diverse instantiations of something, we might actually learn something more general about what it really is, and not just what life is on Earth, which might be this n=1 kind of misleading example. So artificial life also is interesting because it seems to have, there's like a sociological effect where the kinds of people it seems to attract is different than what, for example, modern machine learning attracts. Machine learning, this is like a broad generalization, so it's not going to be strictly true, but tends to draw people in that are very, drawn to numbers and quantification and have a certain, I guess, like engineering bent in the classical sense. Whereas artificial life does tend to draw people that are more qualitative and creative in a more, you could say, more artistic sense. And so the field is bubbling with strangeness. And if you go to the conference, wide range of talks, and some of them might not make sense to you, and some will be just on the fringes of comprehensibility. But it does seem like it's a playground for ideas. And why I think it has a lot of promise is that it's asking kind of like a different kind of question than artificial intelligence. And it could be back to the quote that you mentioned originally from Rich Sutton, that artificial life might be the field that could take the bitter lesson to its extreme. The bitter lesson that you talked about, just this idea that seemingly our own engineering efforts to build things into AI have often been wiped away to some extent by things that leverage search and computation more. And biological evolution is this weird process, weird in the sense that it's like a volitionless process that is just natural law unfolding, and yet yielded volition, yielded us. And so it used, a massive amount, if you want to think in terms of computation and energy, like a massive amount of that, billions of years of Earth-wide computation, I guess, and was able to bootstrap itself up into something quite amazing. We're composed of trillions of cells. We somehow that manifests in the experience that the listeners are having or that you guys are having, which is incredible and insane. And so the thinking might be that artificial life, because it's asking these more similarly basic questions, like life led to intelligence on Earth, it could have revolutionary potential. Now, it could be that it's too basic a question. We don't have billions of years of computation to spend, but I do think that because it's more of a playground, sometimes you'll have this phenomenon where ideas will come up in artificial life and then eventually percolate over into machine learning. One example of that is this algorithm called HyperNeat, which was created by my PhD advisor and some of the students. And it formed the basis of something called hypernetworks, which is now kind of like a machine learning technique, whereas HyperNeat was more like an artificial life evolutionary computation idea. So because it's a playground where you don't have to worry about gradients, you have to worry about certain things and posing things in the same way that you would if you had to pose them in like a machine learning conference, it allows for more ideas to come up. The last thing I would say is that there may be ways to strike a middle ground between pure artificial life. Because in pure artificial life, you might have to ask the question of like, do I need to go all the way down to artificial chemistry? Do I have to create a chemical system, and from there, hopefully through a rich enough simulation of chemicals, I could actually have an evolutionary process, and the evolutionary process would lead to millions cellular, multicellular life that has brains like us or something. That could be computationally super prohibitive, although interesting and maybe possible. You could say, are there ways to abstract evolution to test these ideas in kind of something that's some middle ground between maybe the pure engineering mode of artificial intelligence and the bottom-up mode of the most basic forms of artificial life? I think that's an interesting middle ground, and that's something that field I've been most associated with, openness, tries somewhat to strike that middle position.
I was wanting to go back to the tricky subject you mentioned, and that is the definition of life and intelligence, and how we appropriately define or compartmentalize those things in a manner that isn't important. And I ask this because it's been mentioned for a long time that organizations like businesses, those are a life form, or even religions, those are a life form, maybe like superorganisms, but they are maybe artificial and have degrees of lifelike components. I was wondering if you could discuss that, and especially how that might work with your concepts of flourishing. How at this higher level, we might want to be considering this life as something that enables that flourishing to you.
Yeah, it's a great prompt and complicated. Definitions of these terms are always contentious and complicated, and often involves like a particular vantage point, like a commitment to a particular definition of intelligence can box us in. And I guess like my overall attitude is not to overly fixate on that kind of specific definition because we're probably wrong, whatever our vantage point is right now. I think something important is that when you think of terms like life or intelligence, or when we talk about flourishing, these are part of like an ongoing human scale debate that's been spanning centuries or millennia. And it's hard to imagine that that open-ended process of pinning down some of these things, might ever stop, maybe, or maybe we'll actually find like a definition of intelligence that we think is comprehensive. But I think that thinking of the structures that humans create as forms of life is interesting, and I think does yield important insights. Whether you call it life or not, it definitely seems that there's higher order forms of evolution and agency created by the substrate of humans. So like ideas spread from person to person, and memetics is kind of, I think, an interesting and kind of hard to study field. Ideas are really powerful, and complexes of ideas. I think meme complexes is a term from maybe Susan Blackmore or Richard Dawkins, both who have thought a lot about memetics. Things like religions are structures of thought that can propagate and have defense mechanisms, arguably. The idea of faith is kind of interesting, and that like having faith in a religion, it makes it difficult to permeate or to puncture someone's belief in that thing. Um, Corporations and capitalism and all the structures and institutions that we build, different people will say that they certainly at least have a form of inertia in them. You talk about bureaucracy, it's hard to get away from the accumulation of bureaucracy, or that living in a particular society might constrain the horizon of your thought, the systems that are in there. So like it's kind of subtle, but you're born in a culture and your ideas of right and wrong and what a good person is. People born in a capitalistic society will probably have different ideas of that versus in a more communal society. It's then flourishing. Yeah, we're hitting all the big topics. Um, my interest in flourishing is something in that I'm concerned with how technology is developing and how society is going. That's what spurred my interest in it. But it also relates to this greater topic of open-endedness. As I said earlier, our conception of what it means to flourish changes. There's no fixed definition of that either. And people will try to pin it down. Maybe it's just hedonic happiness over a long horizon. Maybe it's a sense of autonomy. And there's people of, in different fields of psychology or psychotherapy or spirituality have different ideas of what flourishing is. And so it's hard to definitively just pin down. But I guess I think of it in a couple of different ways. One is kind of in terms of the infinite game. There's a book by a philosopher called Finite and Infinite Games. And the infinite game is the one you play so you can keep on playing. And that seems at least like humans are trying to do that at some level. We want human society to keep going. We have some sense of when we flourish the most, maybe when we're around people we care about, when we're engaged in meaningful work, when we're connected to something beyond just our own individual selves. And somehow, I think at present, it's hard for us to talk as a society about that level of things. I'm not exactly sure the reason, but it seems instead we often get drawn into narrow debates. There's an essay I wrote, I think that you're referring to earlier, and we'll just pull up what the name of it is. One is we need positive visions for AI grounded in well-being. When we talk about AI, sometimes we just talk about a narrow aspect of seeing it through the lens of capitalism, which is important. I'm not an anti-capitalist. I think capitalism is a very powerful system that has helped lift humanity out of the state of nature. It's also a complicated thing, has lots of rough edges and positive and negative kinds of things associated with it. But if we view AI strictly through the lens of capitalism, and maybe a straw man of current economic thought, like revealed preferences, just that humans are rational, and what we choose is actually a reflection of our deepest flourishing, which I think few people actually believe, but we do design economic systems kind of around this, about people choosing things, and the consumers, knows best. And if we're, scrolling TikTok for 10 hours, then that's really, what we want to do, and we shouldn't be paternalistically kind of imposing upon that. But I think most people would agree a flourishing society isn't one in which we're all in our little bubbles scrolling TikTok endlessly and ordering Uber Eats as we watch Netflix for 20 years and then we retire and die. It doesn't seem like that's great. Maybe that we need to have a discussion about well-being and flourishing on a higher level. I mentioned earlier that something that precludes us from doing this is that we often get stuck into kind of binary views. It's easy to have a debate about technology being good or bad, but it's really hard in our present environment to talk about nuance. Technology is both good and bad, and particular technology will have good sides and bad sides, and maybe it's the job of society, if we can, to try to steward it towards minimizing the downside and maximizing the upside. Um, how we do that is hard. So maybe I'll stop there.
Would really appreciate if you could also help to distinguish progress versus flourishing, because I
Yeah.
think you had some distinctions that were important.
Yeah, so in a separate essay I wrote, we need a science of flourishing built on metamodernism. Oh, I should also note that the positive visions essay I talked about was written with Amanda No, who spearheaded a lot of that. So I can take some small part of credit for that. So in this thing about science of flourishing, a lot of that essay was about this dichotomy between progress and flourishing. There's a lot of energy, in particular in Silicon Valley, around this movement called progress studies. The idea being that more progress is better from an economic sense of progress, like from abundance. If we could create abundant energy and increase wealth in general, then a lot of positive things downstream from that. On the other side, you have some other people more on the anti-capitalist side saying flourishing is not just economic progress, because you can create simple examples. Like, we made a lot of scientific progress that yielded atomic bombs. Up to that point, no single person could press a big red button and destroy all of humanity. It's not clear yet how that story pans out, whether nuclear weapons will negate a lot of the progress we had previously. We could have a nuclear holocaust. There's lots of examples of, in general, technology and then lots of positive and negative things. So the progress studies is not just about economic progress, but also about technological progress. These are basically the prime movers of benefit. You have these dichotomies, and this dichotomy often is coming from a different ideology. So the progress studies ideology is often something about modernism and economic progress and technological progress, and the grand narrative that we are on an ascendant rise as a species towards a liberal democracy driven world. There's some order to it, and we're going to keep creating better stuff and we will all prosper. Whereas the other side of this, the postmodern side, would critique that narrative and say, well, actually, a lot of times we get progress for some at the expense of others, and that the history of technology is a little bit murky in terms of whether it actually is benefiting us. And the idea is that flourishing is something deeper than this one conception of progress, but also it's not just the postmodern view. So the conclusion of that essay was that, again, we need to be able to talk about nuance, and that there is a perspective that can include both the modern and the postmodern perspective, which is, in my mind, a philosophy called metamodernism, but there's probably other candidates for things that could allow us to talk about these things from a less singular perspective. And the claim is that a lot of our societal discord is downstream of ideological incompatibilities. The world is really complicated, and we need some kind of philosophy that is actually able to match that complexity. And that's arguably something like metamodernism, which we could talk more about or not.
Along those lines, I'm curious as to what your definition of what like something is the most flourishing, like human society, species, everything is the most flourishing. What does that mean? Yes.
Yeah, right. So I think this is interesting and hard. We have a lot of examples of dystopian futures, like the Terminator kind of movies, but we have many fewer examples of what the positive thing is that we're trying to go to. So it could be that sci-fi mostly serves as guardrails against the negative. Um, if you ask me, what is your vision of this kind of positive future, then I would point to a series of nonfiction books by this collective called Hansi Freinacht, which is around metamodernism. They have a vision of what they call a listening society. In this society, not only the material kinds of problems are dealt with, just how we get people to have more choice and abundance in the material sense, but also in the psychological sense, and taking into account having institutions that are driven by how people flourish. Part of that is also helping us to become more articulate about what flourishing means for us and to have better discussions about this. So in some sense, it's kind of like an extension of liberal democracy, really taking science and philosophy seriously in the sense of what is the purpose of a liberal democracy, and how does it actually help us. Maybe the grandest part of the aim of a liberal democracy is for people to self-determine their future and ideally steer that for themselves and for their children towards great futures. This is maybe more of a process-oriented answer than an outcome-oriented answer. I have difficulty understanding like what is the place we want to get to concretely, the abundant, flourishing future, as much as I feel like changing the process such that it naturally would lead to that, and that we get to decide upon that as a society. I think that would be the thing that feels most important to me.
I'm also noticing a pattern across what you mentioned that in economy, we are optimizing for GDP. In RL, we are optimizing for a single reward function. In tech companies, we optimize for engagement metrics. Why do you think as a humanity, we're rooted in optimizing for single objective in different domain rather than more nuanced understanding that you pointed out?
Yeah, I think for one reason, it's that scales. So to have a single measure that you can quantify as something that can actually scale up to the kinds of structures that could be global or national. And so there is a tendency to standardize, to make things repeatable. Like you go to a McDonald's anywhere in the US and the food will be the same. There's a certain comfort in that. Whereas if every person who owned a McDonald's could change the formula in their own way, you might lose track of that. So I think it's simply easier to design those kinds of systems, and they involve less reliance on any particular person, and I guess you could say the wisdom of that person. So like if you have a bureaucracy that's driven by formal rules towards some purpose, then there's a way where that will yield repeatable results. But if it fringes, if something actually would make sense as an exception to the rule, like it really shouldn't be, there's some edge case where ideally some person should be able to override the rules in service of somebody, then you just don't get that. And some of these concepts that we're talking about, like flourishing or anything of these kind of qualitative facets of something, they are much harder to put into numbers and therefore harder to scale. But I think one thing that's exciting about this present wave of AI is that there are ways where we could start to imagine doing qualitative things at scale because the models themselves have a sense of the qualitative, not a perfect sense. So I do think there's reason for hope that we could, in the future, engineer systems that have more of the qualitative within them. There may be other ways of engineering society and processes that are more inclined toward the qualitative. In some places, we're more attuned with that than others, that we do have scalable systems that are qualitative. And these often involve kind of like apprenticeship and kind of like maybe more like you could say like a virtue ethics kind of lens, like a tradition of something. Like what does it mean to be a good scientist, to be a good reporter, to be a good therapist? We have institutions we build up that are not simply about just pushing people through for money, but are about intrinsically, if you're like a reporter, you might actually internalize like I'm in service of truth, and truth is this kind of nebulous concept. Sometimes it's hard to always pin down exactly what we mean by that, but you're in service of truth, and so you're in a community of other kind of truth seekers, and there's like clear norms. Like in order to publish a story, you actually have to have like some level of verification of your sources or something, like to be a good journalist. Um, and in science as well, like to be a good scientist, you go through this PhD process or any kind of process where you have like a mentor, and you learn the ins and outs of what it means to actually to really think critically about things and to have the norms of academia or whatever the process is that can ground out whether your ideas are accepted by the community. And there's always a tension in these kinds of institutions that they can be corrupted over time. That's something we always struggle with. Whereas the incentives from outside that are more singular about like money or whatever the scalable, simple metric is, will tend to seep in, and people will tend to write scientific papers not for truth or something, but to get more citations, to get the promotion, to get grant money. And it's a constant kind of like challenge for the institution to maintain its integrity from outside. And arguably, we live in it where a lot of our institutions are not dealing with that kind of pressure well. A lot of stuff has become more instrumental.
I think I've heard that process called enshittification of systems.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's something you collect over a long period of time, and if you're not getting rid of, if you're not doing the pruning part, then or appropriately adapting with selective pressure, then it's guaranteed to happen. Too big to fail phenomena. So then you get left with these cancerous sort of things that I don't know if you use Ticketmaster. That's one of the ones that is almost like that. Social media and other systems have that general behavior. I think it would be really nice because we're part of the Bottlenecks Institute, and it's really focusing on problem selection, identification, and how we go about figuring the right things to tackle, and maybe done in a as principled way as possible, maybe in a measured way. I was wondering if you could add what you think are bottlenecks at a high scale in general for society, and then go to something more specific and actionable relating to AI and A life research. What are the bottlenecks that are preventing our progress, but maybe flourishing in your perception, so that we can start to focus on those at bigger, higher levels, and then more concrete based on your field of research, so that researchers can hone their insights in these particular areas that have a lot more potential if these bottlenecks were relieved?
Yeah. So I guess at the highest level, I think a lot of the bottlenecks to this, I guess you could say the enshittification kind of process, or maybe another way of saying it is institutional health. Like, what is it we're trying to do as a species or as a country, and do our institutions actually are they actually in service of that? And so like institutions of government, of democracy and voting, and of education. Maybe at some point these things all kind of hung together a little bit. What's the purpose of education? Well, part of it is to become critical thinking and have some sort of civic virtue so that you can participate in democracy well. And the news media will help calling people to account if they go too far astray and help keep us in touch with what's going on so that we can actually meaningfully vote. Maybe the military helps protect one nation influence from others in some ways that they can be self-determining. So all these things might hang together. And it could be that at present, because so much is changing in our environment, technological change, societal change, that these institutions don't really hang together anymore. For example, I'll start to zoom in on social media just as an example, where also I think there could be concrete progress to be made. Social media is like a new kind of media environment. You could view it as a kind of continuation of the 24-hour news cycle, which also has problems. Like in general, the tension between what we might think of a kind of coherent purpose for news, which is to ideally to inform us in some kind of relatively unbiased way, if that's possible, towards holding power to account as citizens. 24-hour news is some way where like the engagement stuff starts creeping in. It's not about what stories are going to inform people as much as what's going to keep you watching, what kind of disaster porn is going to be on there that you can just keep glued for the entire day. Social media is like this interesting new kind of emergence of some kind of medium that has flavors of news in it. A lot of people get their news from social media, and social media now becomes this mediating force. And it's like this kind of new thing that we've created. It's really come on the scene quite quickly, like how quickly it's changed the character of our lives over the past 10, 15 years. It's exerted economic force and moral force upon us and changed so much. You browse this atomized feed of random stuff that's mostly spread through the logic of virality. And we've always had some form of virality, right? It's not that newspapers and other things don't also have this logic, but the curational aspect is just completely gone. It's just only virality. And downstream effect of that is it starts to seep into everything. Like the news channels need to figure out how to make their stuff go viral. And so you have weird celebrity stories, which are already always probably around to some extent, but now it's much more, it has this distortionary effect where it doesn't really matter if it makes sense. Many of us are addicted to this stuff. I wake up in the morning and the first thing I do is check my phone. And I know that healthy, yet, there's some lack of self-control that I have there. So maybe there's some kind of coherence we might be aiming for. There's some way that a lot of the technology we're creating is moving quickly, changing the lives in ways that arguably don't make sense. Like there's no real logic behind it. Maybe we're still discovering that logic. Maybe if it moved more slowly, we naturally would have time to keep our institutions in check. But the pace of our institutions is slow. Laws come slowly and don't keep pace with technological change in a meaningful way. Our education system public education probably is not going to integrate the lessons of AI in whatever world we're moving to quickly enough. Maybe schools should be preparing us for how to deal with social media psychologically or something, and maybe some schools are, but probably most aren't. So social media itself, I do think there's a lot of possibility for something much better to occur in that space. And so partly it'd be like what should social media ideally be? How does it fit into these institutions? Is there a way to actually make it so that it's in service of those things? That's kind of like maybe philosophical. We haven't done much exploration in this space, partly because it's hard to, because social media is often driven by these network effects, which means that what does it mean to actually richly explore all the different kinds of feed algorithms and so on, when most of the people making these things are really, it's hard to explore too deeply because there's the capitalistic impulse to just keep getting more attention. Even if you really had good motives, if you are beholden to shareholders and things like that, there's probably not as much maneuvering room as you'd like. Is there a way to explore that space more? How should that actually look? It could be that there are machine learning algorithms that could help in that. As we've been touching on, it's easier to scale simple quantitative metrics. Attention is something that's really easy to measure. It's just a simple time on site kind of thing. Like you have a clock and you can measure how long someone's on your website, what they click on, and so on. To have a sense of their flourishing is qualitative, it's difficult, and doesn't play nice with a lot of the formalisms of machine learning. The algorithms themselves are not designed with this in mind because it's easier to model humans as engines of revealed preferences. Whatever we do is what we want. It's possible though that we could, and I think people are working on how you actually create richer models of people that is more in line with their values or what they think is important, who they want to be, or what causes them to flourish. There's a place called the Meaning Alignment Institute that's working on how you could have AI algorithms that help you pursue what you find meaningful, and other people are working on similar things. That's one direction from the most philosophical kinds of societal difficulties to maybe algorithmic advances. That's one line I could draw.
Perfect. Also, specifically in your line of work related to A life, I'm really curious as to what the bottlenecks you see there are and evolutionary AI.
Yeah, I think artificial life is interesting because it doesn't attract a whole lot of funding in science or in startups, I think. And it's interesting because the upside of it in terms of understanding is quite large. If we really understood life at a deep level, that would be just a foundational kind of advanced understanding. So I think partly it's historical why it hasn't gotten so much funding. It has gotten, it's mentioned in science fiction, so it can command popular attention. But I think one bottleneck is just um, money, and also it's like this status of working in that field. I think it could be improved. A more some way of motivating like why this is really, really interesting and important and underappreciated. Few fields really offer the potential for Einstein level discovery. But I feel like A-Life has room for many of them. If you really could create a system that was worth running for a billion years and actually would create similar patterns of diversification and complexification in an algorithmic system, I think that would be amazing. I think that would be like a Nobel Prize or something. More concretely, I guess sometimes it's hard. Like conceptually, I think it's like a difficult field. To create an artificial life system where you have some base simulation and you run something like evolution in it. But despite our understanding of biological evolution, like if you ask people to study it, say we understand it, it's still really hard to replicate it in open-ended, continuously innovating kind of sense. So it could be really hard. And maybe that's one reason why it hasn't achieved as much attention. Some people in the field talk about better benchmarks or some kind of clear um, demonstration of the power of A-Life. I do think that's interesting. I guess I'm personally not like a benchmarks type, but I can see the value in that. One way of also thinking about it, a clear moment of when it produced something that you couldn't produce by any other way. So in deep learning, it'd be something like the ImageNet moment, where AlexNet, I can't remember what year it was, maybe 15 years ago now or something, but where like that,
Thank you.
where it was just obvious that this much progress on this really hard benchmark of ImageNet must mean that there's something going on with deep learning. People were skeptical until that moment, and that helped turn the tide, saying like, this is quite an amazing new development. And I don't think A-Life has really had that ImageNet moment. What that would mean would be interesting, whether it's a virtual creature that can do really complicated things and that would have some of the robustness of biology that presently might be lacking in our ML systems. In the 19 Uncertainty paper, we talk about the extremes of generalization that are possible in biology. So like that invasive species are a thing, that you can take a species adapted for one context and actually can outcompete things in another context, like zero shot, like that's crazy. And like human generalizability, like how different this is from present language models. Like we talk about that I can learn to drive in the US and I zero shot drive with discomfort in the UK on the opposite side of the road. Obviously, Waymo's not going to do that. That would be, insane. And so there's something still that we're lacking there. And sometimes it's hard to see what's lacking when you're within the paradigm. Like if the running assumption you have is just we keep scaling things, this robustness to the unknown will just come along naturally for the ride. I think that's a bit naive, but maybe there's a realm where an advance in evolutionary AI or artificial life inspired by those ideas could really show a different kind of behavior that would be really hard to get through the traditional means.
Joel, that was a fantastic conversation. I certainly learned a lot from. I really appreciate that.
Sounds great. It was a pleasure to talk to you, and thanks for indulging me in my monologues.
You're an eloquent speaker,
Thank you.
probably from all those essays that you've also written.
Maybe, maybe.